Energy, war, and famine remain three big concerns as Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters the harsh winter months. European energy preparations appear to be paying off, but the long term is less than certain.
We need to understand if and how the European industry can quickly find a new equilibrium where it can get alternative, competitive energy supplies rather than Russian.
And as the war drags on, a Ukrainian offensive has managed to take back Kherson City, a major regional capital, putting pressure on Vladimir Putin. Russia continues to hold the threat of nuclear catastrophe against Ukraine and the West.
I think Putin sees nuclear weapons more as militarily useful weapons, whereas a dirty bomb or a Zaporizhzhia might be more for punishment or pretext.
Humanitarian concerns are also escalating as cold weather, possible shortages of key supplies, and Russian attacks on power plants could put civilians in dangerous positions as temperatures drop.
Because of all these reasons, there are massive rolling blackouts.
Since the start of the Ukrainian offensive, fears of a Russian military escalation have included the threat of Moscow unleashing a nuclear catastrophe, either with the use of a nuclear weapon, through a staged meltdown at a nuclear power plant, or the use of a so-called dirty bomb.
If Putin were losing the war in Ukraine, if his forces were about to collapse, I think from his point of view, using nuclear weapons would actually be more attractive than losing this war in a humiliating fashion.
Thus far, we haven't seen any evidence of Russia moving its tactical nuclear weapons, smaller nuclear weapons that can fit on something as small as an artillery shell or a mortar round, or what have you, not intercontinental missiles. But it's something we need to be mindful of.
So all Russians turned Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to a military base. So they have mined 2 of 6 nuclear power units. And naturally, by itself, nuclear power plant is an object which is extremely difficult, if possible at all, to take back with military means.
The Biden administration has said that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, there will be catastrophic consequences. The United States will respond decisively. But Biden has said that the United States isn't going to get involved in this conflict. It's hard for me to imagine that he's just going to come right out of the gates and start using nuclear weapons. So I think a third option right down the middle, and maybe would be the sweet spot, would be some kind of conventional military response.
After the Ukrainian offensive pushed Russians out of occupied areas in the east, Russia began bombing Ukrainian energy infrastructure throughout the country.
After Russians started massively bombing Ukraine's power infrastructure since October 10, there were problems both with coal, because Ukraine needed more coal to substitute these nuclear capacities, and there were problems where there was just a lack of capacities inside the country.
The equipment being destroyed, such as power transformers, is not easily replaced.
In some cases, it's just almost impossible to have these spare parts, because in some cases, these transformators, that is a kind of unique equipment and which can be produced only by request.
The rest of Europe has had nearly a full year to prepare for a harsh winter without Russian natural gas. Those plans seem to be paying off.
I think we're already starting to do some of the right things, and we can do more, including looking to alternative sources of energy from the Middle East, from U.S. liquefied natural gas, continue to keep that aid going from Washington to Kyiv.
Ukraine, however, is dealing with the new energy shortages caused by Russian bombings.
When Russians started these massive attacks over energy infrastructure, it seems like that Ukraine would pass the winter safely, that it would be okay, both in terms of capacities and in terms of gas coal stocks. But actually, these attacks have changed everything.
And a looming price cap on Russian oil could also complicate the energy calculations made by Europe.
Early next year, so in a matter of a couple of months, I think Europe will be almost entirely independent from Russian energy already. Because on the one hand, the European embargo on Russian oil will enter into force in the coming weeks now. And that will imply a cut of 90% of the volumes of Russian oil currently traditionally utilized in Europe. On the other hand, Russia has already cut itself more than 80% of its traditional gas supplies to the continent. And therefore, we are already experiencing a very strong decoupling between Europe and Russia on energy.
I think that the Russians could destroy Zaporizhzhia. It would have devastating consequences locally, would take the largest nuclear power plant in Europe offline. And so that is something they could consider. A dirty bomb, I think a dirty bomb wouldn't actually help the Russians very much. My fear with the dirty bomb is that this might be a false flag operation, that the Russians would say, Ukraine's launched a dirty bomb, therefore we're within our right to retaliate with nuclear weapons.
Fertilizer shortages, grain trade issues caused by the conflict, and the fact that farming in Ukraine, a breadbasket of Europe, is now riskier have made agricultural outlooks less bright.
We're on the verge of a food availability crisis right now. And part of it is because we just don't have enough fertilizer available. And so the world really needs those European plants to operate again.
But now we're seeing this is becoming a real security issue with the Russians using food as a weapon of war, turning off and turning on grain supplies as a way to try to coerce and manipulate the West.
Europe continues to grapple with the new reality facing Russian energy imports.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the European imports of solar panels from China, which is the main supplier, have been skyrocketing. That means that more and more families and businesses across Europe are installing solar panels because they prefer to go for this way of generating electricity rather than paying a very expensive electricity bill because the system costs are very high.
The war is likely far from over for Ukrainians, and how this winter goes could dictate the outcome.